It's Carter. Welcome to Panda class.
Mr. Nosey is one of those people who is curious about everything. If he comes across a parcel, he will start to wonder what's inside it. And the more curious he becomes, the more he has to know. And even if it's addressed to someone else, Mr. Nosey will not be able to stop himself from opening it just to have a look. His curiosity always gets the better of him. One day, Mr. Nosey was out for a walk when he met a wizard, and the wizard was holding a small bag. Mr. Nosey, being Mr. Nosey, had to know what was inside the bag. The wizard told him that it was a bag full of magic beans, and Mr. Nosey had to know what the magic was about. "I will give you one bean," said the wizard, "and if you take it home and plant it, you will find out. That is, if you're sure you want to find out." What a silly question. Of course Mr. Nosey was sure he wanted to find out. At home, Mr. Nosey planted the bean in his garden, and the next morning he could not believe his eyes. There, in the middle of the garden, was a giant beanstalk that stretched up into the clouds. As Mr. Nosey was admiring the beanstalk, he had a thought. What could be at the top of the beanstalk? And the more he thought this thought, the more curious he became. And the more curious he became, the more he had to know. So he began to climb the beanstalk. He climbed and he climbed and he climbed right up into the clouds. And when he reached the top, he could not believe his eyes for the second time that day. There in the clouds was a giant castle. And then he had another thought. Who might live in a castle in the clouds? And the thought grew into curiosity, and the curiosity got the better of him. So he set out across the clouds to the castle. The castle door was a giant castle door, and in the giant door there was a giant keyhole. Mr. Nosey cannot pass a keyhole and not have a look inside, and this time was no different, except that this time it was different, because Mr. Nosey could fit right through the keyhole. Once inside, it quickly became clear that the who lived in the castle was a giant. Now you or I would have left the castle as quick as we could. In fact, we would not have been there in the first place. But Mr. Nosey, as you can guess, could not resist having a look around. Mr. Nosey went into the giant's kitchen, and in the corner there were 3 small cupboards. Of course, Mr. Nosey had to look what was inside of them. He opened the first cupboard, and inside was a small bag. But before he could look inside the bag, he heard a terrifying sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the giant's big footsteps somewhere in the castle, and they were getting nearer. Mr. Nosey grabbed the bag, scrambled through the keyhole, and climbed all the way down the beanstalk as fast as he possibly could. When he got safely back at home, he opened the bag and saw that it was full of gold coins. That night, He could not sleep. He lay in bed thinking and thinking about the other two cupboards. What could be inside, he thought. He just had to know. Early the next morning, back up the beanstalk went Mr. Nosey, back through the keyhole and back to the second cupboard in the giant's kitchen. Inside it was a hen. "Oh, that's curious," thought Mr. Nosey to himself, not for the first time in this story. He picked up the hen, and there was a golden egg. "A hen that lays golden eggs," said Mr. Nosey. "I'll need to take this home so I can look closer." Just then, Mr. Nosey heard the heavy boots of the giant coming down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Mr. Nosey tucked the hen quickly under his arm and ran for his life. The hen fascinated Mr. Nosey, but it did not stop him thinking about cupboard number 3. He was so scared of the giant, but he just needed to know. And so the next morning, back to the giant's kitchen he went. He opened the third cupboard, and in it was a golden harp. A golden harp that was singing, "Me, me, 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 me." Mr. Nosey sat and listened to the harp. He felt safe knowing that he could hear the giant's big footsteps coming. Uh-oh, the giant wasn't wearing boots that morning. He was wearing his slippers, which is how he caught Mr. Nosey. "Oh, so you're the thief," boomed the giant. "I have a mind to grind your bones to make my bread." Mr. Nosey's eyes nearly popped out of his head. "But I won't," continued the giant. "I much prefer cornflakes for breakfast. Now, I know what to do with you. Since you are so interested in what's in my cupboards, you can clean them out for me." And Mr. Nosey did, and it took him 3 days. Giant cupboards are, well, they're giant. "Now let that be a lesson to you," said the giant. And you'd think it would have been, but the very next day, Mr. Nosey came upon an empty house, and the front door was open, and on the kitchen were 3 bowls of yummy porridge. But that's another story.
Subscribe.